Hey history hunters! What if I told you that behind America's most beautiful landmarks lie some of the darkest secrets in our nation's history? From government cover-ups to forgotten tragedies, every state has skeletons in their closet. Today, we're uncovering 20 shocking historical events that will completely change how you see these places. And trust me, number 17 will blow your mind. Let's start with New Mexico, where on July 16, 1945, the world's first nuclear weapon was detonated at the Trinity test site. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. Thousands of local residents were never warned about the testing. They were told it was just an ammunition depot explosion. Meanwhile, radioactive fallout rained down on their communities, their livestock, their children. The government knew the risks, but kept it classified for decades. Entire families suffered from mysterious cancers and birth defects, never knowing why until documents were declassified years later. Imagine living your entire life wondering why everyone in your town was getting sick, only to discover your own government had been slowly poisoning you. That's the reality for New Mexico's forgotten victims of atomic testing. Speaking of government experiments, let's talk about Maryland. Between 1948 and 1975, at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, the U.S. Army conducted some of the most unethical human experiments in American history. 7,000 soldiers, that's right, 7,000, were exposed to over 250 different chemical weapons without their knowledge or consent. We're talking about mustard gas, deadly nerve agents, and mind-altering drugs. These weren't volunteers. These were young men who thought they were serving their country, only to become unwilling test subjects in a real-life horror story. The crazy part? No deaths were officially reported because they kept the doses just low enough. Just low enough. Let that sink in. Now let's head to West Virginia, where on December 6, 1907, the Monongah mining disaster became the deadliest industrial accident in American history. Two massive methane explosions ripped through the Fairmont Coal Company's mines, instantly killing hundreds of workers underground. But the explosion was just the beginning of the nightmare. The blast collapsed the ventilation shafts, trapping survivors in a toxic tomb of poisonous gases. 362 men died that day. 362 fathers, sons, and brothers who went to work and never came home. The worst part? There were virtually no safety standards. These men were sent into death traps every single day, and everyone knew it. This tragedy finally sparked public outrage that led to the creation of the Bureau of Mines in 1910. It took 362 deaths to get basic safety protections for American workers. Here's a story that sounds like fiction but is terrifyingly real. In the 1920s, the Osage Nation in Oklahoma struck oil and became some of the wealthiest people per capita in the world. Sounds like the American dream, right? Wrong. That wealth made them targets. Because Congress didn't believe Native Americans could manage their own money, they appointed white guardians to oversee their finances. And that's when the systematic murder began. Over 60 Osage people were poisoned, shot, and bombed by the very people trusted to protect them. These weren't random crimes. This was a calculated genocide for profit. White men literally married into Osage families, then murdered their spouses and children to inherit oil money. This became one of the FBI's first major investigations, and it revealed a conspiracy so deep and so evil that it changed federal law enforcement forever. Everyone knows the Civil War started at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, but the real story is much more complex and tragic than your textbook told you. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces bombarded Fort Sumter for 34 straight hours. But this wasn't just the start of a war. It was the beginning of America's deadliest conflict, claiming nearly 700,000 lives over 4 years. What makes this even more tragic is that many historians believe the war could have been avoided. There were last-minute negotiations, peace talks, and compromise attempts. But political tensions and economic interests were too powerful. South Carolina's decision to fire those first shots changed the course of American history forever. Every American family was touched by this war that started right here, in Charleston Harbor. Michigan holds the dark distinction of being home to the deadliest school attack in American history. And it happened almost 100 years ago, in 1927. Andrew Kehoe was a local farmer and school board treasurer in Bath Township. He was angry about rising property taxes to fund a new school. So he spent months secretly planting dynamite throughout the Bath Consolidated School. On May 18, 1927, Kehoe murdered his wife, destroyed his farm, and then detonated the school during a normal school day. 38 people died instantly, most of them children between 7 and 14 years old. But Kehoe wasn't done. As rescue workers and parents rushed to help, he drove his truck, packed with more explosives, to the school and detonated it, killing himself and several bystanders. The explosion was so powerful it was heard miles away. This single act of terror claimed a quarter of the town's children. The surviving half of the school's explosives failed to detonate, or the death toll would have been even higher. California might have the biggest economy in America, but it also has one of the most dangerous environmental disasters happening right now. Every year, California faces thousands of wildfires that burn millions of acres. In 2020 alone, over 9,600 fires destroyed 4.4 million acres. That's larger than the entire state of Connecticut going up in flames. But here's what's really scary. Many of these fires are preventable. Decades of poor forest management, combined with climate change and urban sprawl into fire-prone areas, has created a perfect storm of destruction. Entire towns have been wiped off the map. Paradise, California, a town of 27,000 people, was completely destroyed in just a few hours during the 2018 Camp Fire. 85 people died, and survivors describe it as literally running for their lives through hell on earth. And it's getting worse every year. Minnesota was the site of the largest public execution in United States history, and the story behind it reveals some of America's darkest chapters regarding Native Americans. The U.S.-Dakota War of 1862 started when Dakota people, facing starvation due to broken government promises and failed crops, finally fought back against encroaching settlers. After a brief conflict lasting just over a month, 400 Dakota men were captured and put on trial. 303 were sentenced to death in what can only be described as a kangaroo court. Some trials lasted just 5 minutes. President Lincoln reduced the number to 38, but on December 26, 1862, these men were publicly hanged simultaneously in the largest mass execution in American history. What makes this even more tragic is that many of the executed men were not even involved in the original fighting. They were condemned based on testimony that was often contradictory and unreliable. Washington state has one of the most bizarre unsolved mysteries in modern America. Since 2007, over 20 human feet, still in shoes, have washed up along the shores of the Salish Sea. These aren't just random remains. The feet are consistently found in running shoes, which apparently protect them from sea life. Some have been identified as belonging to missing persons or suicide victims, but many remain complete mysteries. What's really unsettling is the pattern. They keep appearing year after year with no clear explanation. Are they evidence of foul play, natural decomposition from drowning victims, or something more sinister? Local authorities insist there's no connection between the cases, but the sheer number of discoveries has left investigators and residents deeply unsettled. Imagine taking a peaceful walk on the beach and stumbling upon something like this. Sometimes the worst disasters come from the best intentions. In 1986, Cleveland, Ohio, decided to break a world record by releasing 1.5 million balloons simultaneously for charity. What could go wrong, right? Well, everything. Weather conditions were perfect for disaster. The balloons didn't rise into the upper atmosphere as planned. Instead, a storm system pushed them back down, blanketing the city and Lake Erie in millions of pieces of plastic. Airports were shut down. 2 fishermen went missing on Lake Erie. Their bodies were never found, possibly because rescue helicopters couldn't see through the balloon debris. Waterways were clogged, animals were harmed, and lawsuits poured in. The cleanup cost Cleveland over $5 million. all for a world record that lasted exactly 1 day before being broken by someone else. Sometimes good intentions create the worst disasters. Alaska gave us one of the most disturbing wildlife encounters ever recorded. Timothy Treadwell spent 13 summers living among grizzly bears, convinced he had a special connection with them. Treadwell believed he was protecting the bears and that they accepted him as part of their world. He filmed hours of footage of himself getting dangerously close to these massive predators, often talking to them like pets. On October 5, 2003, Treadwell and his girlfriend Amy Huguenot were both killed and partially consumed by a bear at their campsite. The attack was so violent that experienced park rangers were traumatized by what they found. The most chilling part? Treadwell's camera captured 6 minutes of audio from the attack. The recording has never been released publicly, but those who've heard it describe it as the most horrifying thing they've ever experienced. This tragedy serves as a stark reminder that wild animals are exactly that, wild. No amount of good intentions can change millions of years of predatory instinct. North Carolina almost became a radioactive wasteland in 1961, and most people have never heard this story. A B-52 bomber carrying 2 nuclear bombs was heading to the Arctic when it experienced catastrophic mechanical failure and broke apart over North Carolina. Both bombs fell toward populated areas. One bomb went through its entire arming sequence. Out of 6 safety switches designed to prevent accidental detonation, 5 activated. Only one single switch prevented a nuclear explosion that would have been 250 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. The blast radius would have killed everyone within 8.5 miles instantly and caused radioactive fallout across Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York City. We came within one switch of an unimaginable disaster. A declassified document later revealed that the bomb was so close to exploding that it was very nearly a nuclear catastrophe. One switch. That's all that stood between North Carolina and nuclear annihilation. Wyoming was home to one of America's most shameful chapters, the Heart Mountain internment camp, where 14,000 Japanese Americans were imprisoned during World War II. These weren't enemy soldiers or suspected spies. These were American citizens or teachers, farmers, business owners, children, who were rounded up and forced into concentration camps based solely on their ancestry. Families were given just days to sell their homes, businesses, and belongings for whatever they could get. They were then transported in cattle cars to remote camps surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. At Heart Mountain, people lived in hastily built barracks with no privacy, inadequate heating, and communal bathrooms. Families were separated, businesses destroyed, and dreams shattered, all in the name of national security. What makes this even more tragic is that many of these families had sons fighting for America in Europe, while their parents were imprisoned by the same government they were dying to defend. Before America was even America, Virginia was the site of one of the most horrific survival stories in colonial history. The winter of 1609 to 1610 at Jamestown became known as the Starving Time. A combination of harsh weather, failed crops, disease, and conflicts with Native Americans created a perfect storm of death. When food ran out, colonists ate their horses, then their dogs, then rats, and finally, each other. Archaeological evidence has confirmed cases of cannibalism, including a 14-year-old girl whose remains show clear evidence of being butchered for food. Of the 300 colonists who entered that winter, only 60 survived to see spring. That's an 80% mortality rate. Imagine being so desperate for survival that you'd eat leather from your shoes, and then imagine even that running out. This wasn't just hunger. This was a complete breakdown of civilization, where ordinary people were forced to make unthinkable choices just to survive another day. Arkansas was the site of one of the deadliest racial massacres in American history, and most people have never heard of it. In 1919, African-American sharecroppers in Elaine, Arkansas, organized to demand fair prices for their cotton crops. They were systematically cheated by white landowners and wanted basic economic justice. When they held a meeting to discuss forming a union, white men showed up to investigate. Shots were fired, No one knows who shot first, and one white man was killed. What happened next was genocide. White mobs, joined by federal troops, went on a killing spree that lasted for days. They shot African Americans on sight, burned homes, and tortured suspects for confessions to crimes they didn't commit. Conservative estimates put the death toll at over 200 African Americans. Some historians believe it was much higher. Bodies were thrown into mass graves or the Mississippi River to hide the evidence. This wasn't a riot. It was a massacre of American citizens whose only crime was asking for fair wages. Iowa gave us one of America's strangest unsolved mysteries. In 1903, the small town of Van Meter was terrorized by something that defied explanation. For several nights, multiple credible witnesses reported seeing a massive, bat-like creature with glowing horns flying through the town. This wasn't just one person's hallucination. Dozens of people saw the same thing. The creature was described as having huge wings, sharp claws, and a horn on its head that emitted a bright light. It made a terrible smell and a sound like nothing anyone had ever heard. Armed townspeople shot at the creature multiple times, apparently hitting it, but it kept flying. Finally, it disappeared into an abandoned mine shaft and was never seen again. What makes this story fascinating is the consistency of the witness accounts and the credibility of the people involved, including business owners, the town doctor, and the bank cashier. What did the people of Van Meter really see? Georgia is home to one of the weirdest legal oddities in America, a tree that literally owns itself and the land around it. In Athens, Georgia, there's a white oak tree that legally owns itself and 8 feet of land in all directions. This isn't a joke or a tourist gimmick. It's an actual legal deed from the 1800s. Colonel William Jackson loved this particular oak tree so much that he deeded it to itself, making it perhaps the only non-human property owner in America. When the original tree fell in 1942, a new tree grew from one of its acorns and legally inherited the property. So technically, this tree has more property rights than many Americans. What makes this bad for Georgia? Well, it's a constant reminder that sometimes trees have more secure land ownership than people do. In a state with a complex history of land disputes and property rights, there's something almost mockingly ironic about a tree having unquestionable ownership while humans have fought and died over the same basic right. Utah's Bonneville Salt Flats look like an alien landscape, which made them perfect for speed testing in the 1920s. Unfortunately, they also became a death trap. As automobiles advanced, adrenaline junkies flocked to Bonneville to see just how fast they could go on the perfectly flat, seemingly endless surface. It looked safe. What could go wrong on a completely flat plain? Everything. The salt surface was unpredictable. Cars would hit soft spots and flip at 200+ miles per hour. The isolation meant that crashes were often fatal simply because help was hours away. Weather could change instantly, creating whiteout conditions where drivers couldn't see anything. Some drivers simply disappeared, their cars and bodies never found in the vast expanse. The tradition continues today, but with much better safety equipment. Still, the Bonneville Salt Flats remain a place where the pursuit of speed regularly claims lives. New Jersey was ground zero for one of the most horrific industrial poisoning cases in American history. In the early 1900s, young women were hired to paint watch dials with radium-based paint to make them glow in the dark. They were told the radium was completely safe. So safe that managers encouraged them to lick their brushes to create fine points for detailed work. The women were literally ingesting radioactive material every day. The company owners knew radium was dangerous. They used lead shields and tongs when handling it, but they told the workers it was harmless. Soon, the women began getting sick. Their jaws rotted away. Their bones crumbled. They developed cancers throughout their bodies. Between 1917 and 1927, over 50 women died horrible, painful deaths from radiation poisoning. When the surviving women tried to sue, they were told they waited too long. The statute of limitations had expired. It took years of legal battles to get justice, and their case helped establish workers' rights to know about workplace hazards. These women literally glowed in the dark from the radium in their bodies. Their sacrifice led to workplace safety laws that protect millions of workers today. Nevada is home to one of the most critically endangered species on Earth, and their story represents everything wrong with human environmental impact. The Devil's Hole pupfish lives in only one place on Earth, a single water-filled cavern in Death Valley. They've survived there for over 10,000 years, making them one of the most resilient species on the planet. But human development nearly drove them extinct. Groundwater pumping for agriculture and development lowered the water level in Devil's Hole, threatening their only habitat. At their lowest point in 2013, only 35 fish remained. 35. The entire species could have fit in a single aquarium. Massive conservation efforts have brought their numbers up slightly. There are now about 100 to 150 fish, but they remain critically endangered. This tiny fish represents the broader environmental crisis facing our planet. What makes this especially tragic is that these fish survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, and 10,000 years of natural disasters, only to nearly be wiped out by human activity in less than 50 years. And there you have it, 20 dark chapters from American history that show us the real complexity of our nation's past. From government cover-ups to natural disasters, from human cruelty to environmental destruction, every state has stories that remind us that history is never as simple as it seems.